right? But then we're seeing employers starting to be more open to potentially mandating and less opposed to it, right? So they still may be in this middle ground of we don't know what we're doing and we're not doing anything yet, but it looks like the tide's shifting as far as people's comfort level with where they want to go. So that's why I thought this was kind of interesting. So, you know, we saw 64% of employers who changed their policy after the Delta variant surge. So, you know, certain places, you know, obviously were hit harder in the country than Colorado, but definitely was a factor here. So here's the factors that led employers to feel more comfortable with the idea of vaccine mandates. Again, maybe they're not mandating yet, but they're getting more comfortable with the idea of it. So they're serving, you know, we're seeing this greater good. I was actually on a call. Goodness, was that just last Monday? I lose track of time these days. Well, large nationwide retailers this is where they're going. They feel like that they need to lead the way. They need to show that this is what we should be doing. So we expect to see some more vaccine mandates coming that direction. More, you know, feel like the law permits it. Is their workforce becoming more receptive? You know, is it a way to appeal to customers and their staff? And then 12% even wanted to see more remote workers getting back into the work office. You know, and that's something, I mean, here, a lot of you probably have been working throughout the pandemic, right? If, you know, you've got more than just office workers, but that's definitely been an issue for our clients that primarily have office staff, is how do we get people back in the work, well, you know, in the offices and get them, you know, out of their homes. So definitely a consideration. So what does an informational campaign look like? So, you know, we hear a lot of employers are trying to put out their own information. And this was something that was really important through 2020, was that employees were looking to their employers to give them information because they were being bombarded, you know, in the media, and they didn't quite know who to trust and what it looks like. So, you know, we've always supported, you know, being very proactive and getting information out to your employees. And I think the same applies here for vaccines. So, you know, if you're trying to improve vaccination rates, you know, one of the ways to do that is just by putting out information for your employees and trying to address their concerns and misconceptions. You know, and that's something that, you know, we've seen go a long ways, even throughout last year when we were just dealing with what is COVID, right? When we were all first kind of started on that level, and, you know, what about masks, and do they work, and do we need an N95, and what does that mean? And all these questions, and being able to answer those is really helpful. One of the things we recommend is kind of having these question and answer sessions. So we know, you know, some of our clients during 2020, I think we're still in COVID, but during 2020, we're doing weekly, you know, Zoom calls with, you know, upper management with the whole company, of trying to just get people updated and give them information. You know, it's something to really think about continuing now. I mean, I think, you know, we all thought we were coming out of this and maybe, you know, what, April, May of this year. Now that we know we're probably not coming out just yet, going back to sharing this information becomes really important for your workers. So there's a lot of materials, you know, I mean, we've got a ton on our website. So if you haven't gone and looked at fisherphillips.com, we've got a ton of free stuff on our website and things you can use. You know, but talking to employees about, you know, using those materials, talking to them about talking to their doctor is really important, and medical provider, right? And who are they getting their information from? That tends to be really important, especially when it comes to vaccines. I mean, a lot of times that's where we refer people as, well, why don't you go talk to your, you know, your primary care doctor, the person you've gone to for 20 or 30 years that you've trusted with your health. Go talk to them about it. You know, don't just read on Facebook and trust what, you know, your friend from high school is telling you, right? I mean, it's kind of getting away from that information that we're all kind of in our face all the time. Has anyone done that? I mean, has any companies here, have you all kind of done these informational campaigns or putting information out to your employees on a regular basis? Are you finding that they have been helpful or raised more questions? What do you think? A lot more questions? Yeah. You think in a good way? Like it?
I think it's, yeah.
Uh-huh. I agree. Yeah. So one of the questions, what's your name too? Colin, thank you. What Colin was telling us was that they've done an informational campaign and they've really pushed to go talk to your PCP, talk to your primary care doctor. to try to help answer people's questions. And that's a really good way to do it, and try to, limit, where you're getting your information. So let's talk about incentives. So incentives is taken one more step. So, it's a little bit more than just we want to educate our workforce. This is where a company's deciding we want to try to push vaccine rates, right? Because from a quarantine standpoint, we know if you're vaccinated, you get exposed. If you don't show symptoms and don't test positive, you can stay in the workplace, right, with a mask on. So that's, from an employer standpoint, there is a reason to want to push these other than just, you may think it's the right thing to do, but it also keeps your workers on the job. And at construction sites, that can be huge because you may have 3 or 4 different companies on a site, right? So we saw that in 2020 when we would have an outbreak with one company and it would spread to like all of the contractors on the site. Which may be why, some of you, if you're a subcontractor, you may be hearing from your general contractor, we want all your employees vaccinated that are coming on our site, right? So we'll talk about that today. You may also hear that from an owner, right? An owner of the project may say, we want all workers coming on this project to be vaccinated. So we'll talk about what that looks like when we get to vaccines. Or get to mandates, but this is incentive. So this is like one more step. So here we want to encourage it and we want to be a little more proactive than just putting out information. So under the Trump administration, there were proposed rules that went out governing incentives. Those were withdrawn by the Biden administration. So that's why I said we had this change of the guard. So we had some change of what you could do and could not do based on it, the Biden administration really trying to push vaccines. So the EEOC came out in May, just May of 2021 with 2 options. So if you, as the organization, are administering the vaccine, and we'll talk about what that means, you can offer incentives, but they can't be so substantial to be considered coercive. So a little more restriction, and they don't give us a lot of guidance on that. So it becomes how much is too much, right? An employee could turn down $50. Could they turn down $200? Maybe not. So so the second one is where you want to be. If you're employed, so this is where you're not administering the vaccine. This is where you're going to incentivize your employee to go get the vaccine at Target or Walgreens, right? Go get it somewhere else. And they come in and they voluntarily provide you documentation that confirms that they've gotten the vaccine. They got it from their own pharmacy or doctor, wherever they got it. And then you offer an incentive. The EOC has said that doesn't have the limits like it does if you administer it. So one thing that we've wondered is what if you're just offering it on your site? Starts to get a little dicier. But something to consider that you can offer a bigger incentive if they're getting it elsewhere. So we'll talk about, I'm getting ready to, we'll talk about some things what that looks like. So who's an agent for someone who gives it? So it's been defined as an individual or entity that has the authority to act on the behalf of the employer. So if you have on-site medical staff, you have on-site clinics, if they're doing the vaccines, you want to make sure your incentive is not too high, right? Because you're still going to be in that category. So you want to keep a wall between you and the healthcare provider that's providing it. So if you're setting up a vaccine clinic at your work site, which we have seen some construction sites do recently, make sure there's a wall, right? So you've hired a third-party company, they're coming in, they're doing it, you're not seeing these records, right? We're not involved in it. We've just contracted with, Health One or whoever it may be, but they are providing the nurses, they're doing the records, right? You're just basically providing a site. To me, that would be okay, because you still have that wall between you and the company doing it. You're not really putting your hands into the healthcare side of it. Now, being lawyers, we have to warn you, there still is an ADA wellness rule out there. So there's probably some upper limit on the incentive you can offer. So we still say, try not to get it too high, right? Because, there's still wellness rules that exist that could possibly be used if someone tried to bring a lawsuit claiming this coerced them into it. So, EOC, definitely de minimis is fine. I think you could even get higher, but let's not give everybody $1,000. Maybe then we start to get a little too high, right? So what does it look like? And I won't skip ahead so I don't mess up Colin, but we'll get to some of the examples in a minute. So one thing to keep in mind if you do incentives, just like a mandatory program, you have got to offer an alternative means for someone to earn it if they are unable to earn the vaccine or unable to get the vaccine for a disability or religious objection. So not just because they don't want to, because obviously that kind of defeats the purpose, right? But if someone, provides you a religious objection, it's supposed to be a bona fide, sincerely held belief that they cannot and will not get it, or they have a doctor's note that says for whatever medical reason, disability reason, they cannot get a vaccine. You want to offer an alternative way for them to earn the incentive, because they cannot. So, but those are your two exceptions. Dave, what are you thinking?
We offered 4 hours of PTO.
Okay.
How do you that some of these things
So let me put that down. I don't think you are. I mean, these are the options that we've come up with. Obviously, it's not a a complete list, but we've talked about watching the COVID-19 safety video. Maybe there's COVID-19 testing that they'd have to do, that they agree to. Do they have to, go through some CDC literature and training about how not to spread it because they're still unvaccinated in the workplace? So, are they watching videos? I mean, goodness, we all think we've been inundated with it, but maybe they're watching the video about, how to try to avoid it and washing your hands 20 seconds. So that's kind of the best we've come up with, Dave, but it, just trying to come up with another way for them to earn that incentive. If they have those objections and and we recommend having a form. I believe we've got templates on our website you can use for religious accommodation and the disability accommodation. Have them fill out the form, right? Don't just let them come to you and say, yeah, I've got a religious problem with this. They need to fill out the form and go through the paperwork and go through the process so we can determine that it is a legitimate objection and not just that they don't want to get it.
We just quickly mentioned that his offer.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. For people on the video, so Dave was talking about that they've offered some incentives, but struggling with how do you come up with something else for people who don't want to get it. And it may be, Dave, if you haven't had anyone raise the accommodation, it hasn't become an issue yet, right? You may just have people that don't want to get it, so they just haven't raised the issue. Yeah, no problem. Sorry, forget about that. Couple other considerations here. So want to make sure that we maintain documents confidentially, right? That kind of goes without saying when you're taking down employees' vaccination status. So you cannot offer incentives to your employees in return for their family members getting vaccinated. So keep that in mind, because there are some wellness rules that we would see programs when you have families on health insurance, right? And some of the wellness rules would apply. The EOC has said with vaccinations, you can't offer the incentive to get their family vaccinated, which would be nice because a lot of times that's where some of the exposure comes from. But that's just one of the rules here. But you can offer the family member the opportunity to be vaccinated by your organization. If you're doing a clinic on your site, you can open up that to your employees and their family, right? And do that. Just can't offer the incentive to the family members to get vaccinated. So what are some of the options? Dave had mentioned, PTO is definitely something we've seen, from a day of PTO, the 4 hours of PTO. We've seen cash. I think the most I've seen is probably 200 or 250 for employees, and which I think still stays, on the lower end now. 6 months ago, when we weren't quite sure what the rules are, that would have felt a little higher, but now I think you'll be okay in that one. We've seen raffles. There are some different rules there. So if you're going to do a raffle and put everybody's name in the hat, talk to your in-house counsel or HR, because there are some other rules that apply to raffles, unfortunately, which I think the organization ASSP probably knows, right? Because we used to do a raffle. Yeah, there's always issues with the raffle. So those, whenever you hear that, makes me nervous. We've seen people give away fitness equipment, give vacation time, right? So, there's really not a limit on what you can do. You can be creative for what appeals to your workplace. Well, yeah, as Lori was saying, do fitness equipment instead of donuts. So maybe they'll like that better. We are in Colorado, so that could help. All right. So any questions about incentive programs? What that looks like? Yeah.
What about the disincentives? You've got like Delta Airlines, $200 a month for employees that aren't.
Yeah, really good question. Good question. So the question was about disincentives. So you might have seen in the news, Delta Airlines offering, I think it was $200 a month more in health insurance if they were not vaccinated. And I heard they had a huge jump, right, in vaccination rates after they did that. I don't know what the numbers were, but that's what I'd read. So there are one of our benefits guys actually just put out an alert like last week on doing that, because there's a lot of kind of legal hoops to be aware of with doing that. So one, it is something we've heard floated around a lot, because a lot of you may know a lot of health insurance programs do that to smokers already, right? If you're a smoker on your health insurance plan, many times you will pay more money than a non-smoker. So there is some precedent for doing this. But it is one of those that if you want to go that route, definitely talk with your legal counsel and your benefits counsel about setting it up, because there are some legal loopholes to kind of, or legal hoops, I should say, to get through. I'm not a benefits lawyer, so I don't get into the weeds on those, but I know enough to say that those get trickier than incentives because of the way the plan program works. And I think what I was reading was you can't be too high, like the disincentive, as far as what it looks like. And it's based on the percentage of your employees. Like there's a lot of numbers that go into that calculation. So if you're thinking about that, just make sure you're talking to your benefits people and your health insurance providers to make sure you're staying within those limits. Yeah.
Assume you're gonna talk about this later, but I'm assuming if your company has a mandate for vaccines,
Mm-hmm.
hiring those that don't want to mandate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will talk about that. So Joe was asking about when we get to mandates, talking about people who get fired who don't want to meet it. So yes, we'll definitely talk about that, because we've had employers that have done that. So, and have gone that route. So, all right. So let me go back one second. So let's talk about what we're seeing, kind of the opposite side of, if we have a mandate, what do we do with those who are unvaccinated, whether that's because of choice or, let's say medical disability. That they cannot get vaccinated. So it's becoming more popular now. And I think we saw this when President Biden put out the federal order, for federal contractors, put out the executive order that federal contractors were going to have to be vaccinated or do weekly testing. And after that came out, we started seeing it kind of trickle down. So we're, starting to see a growing number of municipalities, so governments that are doing this. Starting to see private employers that are saying, okay, well, what we'll do then is we'll implement a vaccine mandate. And if you don't want to do it, then we'll do weekly testing. So instead of firing people, like to Jeff's point, which is what people said, well, yeah, we're already in a worker shortage issue, especially here in Colorado. We really don't want to fire people. They go to weekly testing, with, I think, the idea being, to be honest, like, are people going to get so sick of the weekly testing that they just go get vaccinated, right? I think that's kind of the point that no one's talking about, but it seems to be why, one, we have weekly testing, we're keeping them on the site, but two, are we going to, are they eventually just going to say, I'll get tested? Yeah, Dave.
On the weekly testing.
Yeah.
How about like employer paid versus employee paid?
Yeah, so I talk about, like, that is a big issue. Let me see. I think that's my next one. Yeah, let's talk about that next, because no, the pay is a huge issue. Before we talk about the pay, though, I want to talk about the Colorado State order and the Denver order to make sure everybody knows, especially if you're a contractor. So our Colorado State mandate right now is mandating that direct contractors and support staff in healthcare get their first dose by the end of September, second dose by the end of October. So one thing to keep in mind is that it talks about that state contractors that physically enter state buildings have to be vaccinated. And it looked like that the accommodation is you do remote work. But that's the state order, which is different than Denver, right? So Denver, the city of Denver issued an order requiring mandates for city employees and then public and private employers. So that different than the state, who's kind of kept it in the public realm. But to the Denver order, you've got same healthcare, homeless shelters, jails, hospitals, nursing homes, but then also to all contractors of the city of Denver. So we had heard over the weekend, Denver had issued another order that had adopted the most recent public health order and had said they'd rescinded it. But then we found out this morning they've not rescinded that. So I don't know if any of you were paying attention with what was going on over the weekend. But from what I was told this morning, this is how quick this stuff changes. Denver's vaccine order is still in place for contractors, because I know that the construction industry and a lot of industry groups have been gently pushing back on that and having conversations with the city of Denver on that. But from what we were told this morning, it is still in place. So, yeah.
So there's a question on the computer
Mhm.
just about that not being directed at their employees. It was for the entire population, so don't think it counts. It wasn't directed at their employees. It was for the entire population. I'm not quite sure I
Yeah, you might ask them, it'll clarify, yeah, what that means. So it was directed to city employees and but it's directed to contractors of the city. So that's the problem. Is if you are a city contractor, you have, contracts with the city and county of Denver, then you're going to be looking at those contracts and what your vaccines are. Yeah, Dave.
What do you actually do? I just want to make sure if you're doing a private job in the city and county, it doesn't apply.
Correct.
But private.
That's right. Private job. Yes. So this would apply if you are a contractor to the city of Denver. Yes. Or you're a contractor. The only time would be if you're a contractor to a hospital. So if you are doing a job in a hospital or a school, right? And because they have the vaccine mandate for their contractors. Or the state, if you're doing a job for the state of Colorado. So yeah, let me see if the next one's on the pay here. Let's see. Nope, we got a couple more. We'll get to those. Yeah, that's such a good question. To comply, if you've got a city or state mandate out there that you've got to comply with, so you're being told, let's say by your general contractor, that they want all employees on the site to be vaccinated, then you've got to collect that information from your employees, right? To determine if they're vaccinated, to determine if they need to be tested. So again, you want to comply, keep the information confidential. We recommend viewing the vaccine card, but not actually getting a copy if you can avoid it. I know that some hospitals are requiring their contractors to upload copies of the vaccine card, so you may not be able to avoid taking a copy of it. But we recommended trying to view it, have a spreadsheet, right, that has all the names on it, and you're checking people off that you've verified that they've shown you their card and they are in fact fully vaccinated as that's defined. Determine how often you're going to test them, right? So, I saw in the last amended public health order that Governor Polis issued, I think we're on number 6, that came out at just the end of August, so just last week. He's recommending daily rapid test and weekly PCR tests. And it's just recommended, so that's not a requirement. So you can still choose, but that's what's being recommended. So, but we've seen a lot of employers do the weekly testing or twice weekly and not use the rapid test. Because unfortunately, we know the rapid tests have quite a high negative rate. So a lot of employers don't like to use those. But you're trying to do frequent enough that you could catch something, right? So are they going to come in on Monday morning with it, and then you get another one on Wednesday or Thursday? What does that look like for your workers? Yeah.
Do you have some questions on those? Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Colin.
Do you want to hit them as we go or after?
Yeah. So let me go through this section and then we'll get those. Yeah, because we might answer these with some of them. So if you have to do weekly testing because you have unvaccinated workers and that's the requirement for your job, put the policy in writing. And then this is where we talk about complying with applicable wage and hour laws. So we are recommending that if you require weekly testing because you have to for this job or this contract, that you as the employer pay for that test and for the time being tested. So yeah, with your question, Dave, I mean, it's one of those that there is an argument that is it integral to the job, but if you're requiring it and it's for the safety, I mean, as we're all safety professionals, how do we say that's not integral to the job? So, but we do have some smaller employers that, I talked to one last week, they have all their employees vaccinated but one. And so they're not going to pay for it because he was like, we're going to take the risk because it's one employee and we'll take the risk and we really want her to get vaccinated. So we're not going to pay for the test. It's obviously a risk an employer can choose to take. But just understand that, if you have a lot of employees, then that's a lot more money, right? If someone would come at you with a wage and hour class action for not being paid, think of it, similar to years ago, we started having all the, the lawsuits for employees that were, they call it donning and doffing. You might've seen that in the headlines, right? Where they're putting on their gear to go to work. This is similar, right? If we're going to require this test to enter the job site, it's hard for me to argue why they're not getting paid for that time. Determine how you're going to handle positive tests, right? So how long someone's going to be out. I think most of us, we've been living that CDC protocol for a while, but make sure that's in your written policy and that you have your return to work protocols in place. And with the contact tracing, that employees know we still have to do contact tracing. That's one reason why, 3-4 months ago, we started saying you could get proof of vaccination. So one, we could let you remove your mask if you were vaccinated, but also so we knew if you had a quarantine or not, if you got exposed. So, but make sure that's all in your policy as to what you're doing. I think let me see, Laura, I think I've just got just a couple more on this section, then we'll take these questions. We've definitely seen an uptick in requests for accommodation, for exemption from both vaccination and testing. So it's interesting because, you know, we will see what appear to be legitimate doctor's notes and clergy notes on vaccinations, but the testing was a new one. We saw where someone said, I can't get a COVID test. I object to a COVID test. I don't know what we do with that, right? I mean, that's one of those that I'm like, well, if we can't get vaccinated and we can't test you, then that's where you may get to your point that they may not be employed anymore, right? If we can't keep them on this job, if we, you know, I mean, this becomes, you know, we hear that a lot. I do a lot of mining work, and we would see cases where people couldn't wear steel toe boots. And it's like, well, then you can't work in mining, right? Probably construction too. I mean, there's certain, at some point, this becomes a requirement that people may not be able to meet. Just know that your written policy should have an accommodation request process though. So have the forms and have the employees fill those out if they're requesting an accommodation, so that you can talk it through with them. Because that's really what's important, is that you want to have this interactive process to talk with them about it. You know, can we accommodate them? Do we still have jobs that we can move you to? I was talking to a contractor a couple weeks ago that their technicians go on site to companies. And they told me, they're like, we're probably at 85 to 90% of our customers are saying anyone who comes on site must be vaccinated. So they said the problem is we've been able to move people around, right? So if you're vaccinated, I'm going to move you to this job, and I'm moving people who aren't to the jobs where we don't have that mandate. And they said, we're getting to the point that we're going to run out of jobs to be able to move people that are unvaccinated. You know, so that's where, as you, the employer, get to that point of, do you still have a job for them? Can you still accommodate the requests to not be vaccinated? So, I mean, it really becomes an individualized discussion at the time. And one of the things to keep in mind is it is a discussion, right? So it is a back and forth, especially when there's, you know, a mandate, or here where we've got a requirement from an owner or a general contractor that everyone's vaccinated. That's a mandate. You got to treat it that way, have that interactive process to determine, is testing going to work? Are they going to wear a mask the whole time? Is that going to be sufficient? Do we have another job to move them to? You may get to the point you don't have work for them. It's, you know, that's where we're going. But yeah, let me ask you, what questions do you have on this section, Lori? We'll see.
We have one. It is sample.
Okay, there we go.
What is the rationale for not keeping a copy of the vaccine card?
Oh, good question. So I should cover that. So one of the things, and you're all safety professionals, so I love this audience because you can weigh in on this. So we have been debating internally in our workplace safety group whether that vaccine card qualifies as a medical record under OSHA standard that requires a 30-year retention, right? Because it's medical record, it's filled out by a nurse, healthcare professional. We're using it for workplace exposure. So that's the concern. I have not seen, if someone has seen it, I'd love to know. We have not seen where OSHA has come out and said one way or another on vaccine cards as to whether it meets that 30-year definition. So our view has been, if you don't have to take a copy, then you get to avoid that issue and you don't have to think about if we have to maintain it for 30 years. So that's been the concern. So I don't know if anyone in this room has thought about that. You all are safety professionals as well, and what that looks like, but that's been our concern, is that would we have to maintain it that long?
So
Let me come up here.
So
Okay.
there's a follow-up question through the survey that might be answered to that, is
Okay.
that, like, if you take a copy and it's not an original, or, you know, it's not a real vaccine card that's going around, is there any liability? Who do they tag the liability onto?
Oh, like
if
it.
they didn't provide an authentic vaccine card?
So I've seen that fall back to the employee, not the employer. I mean, obviously, if someone, I guess, shows you something in crayon or it's filled out, you know, with like fake name writing, we've seen some crazy stuff. Then I think you'd have an obligation. But to me, if it passes the reasonable test when you look at it and it ends up being false, because there are some that, you know, look just like the originals that they prove to be false, to me, that would not be on you. If you looked at it and had a reasonable basis, right? That reasonable test that, you know, it looked pretty legitimate. To me, that would fall to the employee, because at that point they've produced falsified records, right? So, I mean, to me, that falls back to the employees, you know, that they've just like falsifying any kind of other record. Yeah. Okay, one second, we'll come to this.
I can't see it.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you have any idea about the percentages of false?
Good question. Yeah. So the question was, any idea about the number of false vaccine cards? I don't. From the articles we've read, it's not as many, right? Because kind of makes the headlines, you know, when there is one, but it doesn't seem to be as many as we think, but I could be wrong on that. I haven't seen the numbers though. Yeah. Was there any more? Was there another one?
Can a company have employees keep a sticker on their badge that they have been vaccinated?
Yeah, so question is, can employees keep a sticker on their badge? You can. 6 months ago, that would have made me really nervous to be putting stickers on hard hats. But we've done it. And we did it with masking, right? So it became that because 9 months ago, OSHA had language out there that said, do not treat vaccinated and unvaccinated workers differently, right? They said, don't distinguish. So I would have said, yeah, don't do that. But then they came out saying, oh, well, now you can treat them differently. Once the CDC was at March, they published their guidance on masking, saying that vaccinated workers can remove their mask, unvaccinated need a mask. OSHA came out saying, we support that guidance. And by the way, you employers need to keep unvaccinated workers safe. We're more worried about them now. So, you know, now I'm like, okay, so I think you can. I think it's got to be, you know, one of the things we've talked about is if you do that, is there a way to roll out, you know, training among your workforce about not shaming people for not being vaccinated? We saw that with masking. I mean, in our workplace, like in our office, you don't have to wear a mask if you're vaccinated. I think we're almost 100% in our office, but we're all office workers. It looks different. But some people still choose to wear their mask, right? Because they may have, like I have little kids at home that can't get vaccinated. And I'm sure others of you are in that same boat. So you may choose to wear a mask. So we try to do training on just because someone has a mask on doesn't mean they're not vaccinated. So let's not shame them. So I think you'd have to have some of that training, you know, sensitivity training a little bit. You know, we're not going to discuss politics in the workplace before you do that. Otherwise, you know, I think things can sometimes get heated. Yeah, Jeff.
So we have clients that are requiring that our employees present proof of vaccination before they allow that on their site.
Okay.
So it's not like a sticker, they wouldn't accept that or us.
So they just have to actually show their card to the client. Yeah, and that's, you know, and that almost makes me a little more nervous because that client employee, they don't have an employee-employer relationship, right? And so one of the things that we've done, we've got a consent form. It's out there. If it's not on the website, let me know. I'm happy to send it to you. That where employees sign and they agree to provide proof of vaccination to a client, to an owner, to a general in order to work on this site. And they agree that that's one of the conditions to do it. So I like that simply from the fact that it lets the employee know, hey, this is coming. Even though they may know, it puts it in writing. We get their signature that they acknowledge. I'm going to have to show my card. So then later on, they're not saying, hey, you didn't keep this confidential. Or when I went there, I felt like this was an invasion of my privacy because it is still confidential information. We can all choose to disclose it, right? So if I want to take my mask off, I choose to put a dot on my badge that says I'm vaccinated so I can take my mask off. Well, I can sign a consent for you, my employer, and say, I agree. You can disclose my status that I'm vaccinated because I want to take my mask off. If I don't want to disclose my status, I keep my mask on, right? I mean, it's a little harder now because now we're into vaccine mandates, not just taking a mask off. So you have to disclose it to work on that job. But I still like the consent forms, even if it's something short and simple, just letting them know, hey, this is a part of this job and you're going to have to show it. Everybody agree. Otherwise, you can't work on this site. Yeah. Go ahead, Lori.
So is there any preference to whether the employer shows the employee's card to the client or it has to be the employee themselves?
So the question is, what's the preference? Employee shows the owner or the employee? I like it where the employer can represent to the owner. I've looked at their cards. All these guys are vaccinated. And the reason I prefer that is because the employer to the employee has that, you know, relationship. We know you're keeping it confidential. You know, you have an obligation to your employees to do that, and you can control the data, you control the information, and you're telling, you know, from need to know person to need to know person, right? Versus if they're just showing somebody at the gate, we don't know. You may not be able to get away with that. Like I said, I know some hospitals are requiring their contractors to upload copies of cards, and you're going to end up doing that because you're going to keep the work and keep the job. But yeah, ideally, you as the employer would check your employees, you'd mark everybody off, and then you'd represent to that company, that owner, hey, I've checked it. These guys are all clear. Yeah.
So let's talk about job sites that have piecework.
Okay.
Maybe it's, you know, the same guys, and tomorrow it's a bunch of different guys. And Friday it's a whole bunch of different. How do you manage showing that vaccination status.
Yeah, that's hard because
There are some job sites where there's changes out there and the superintendent. Sometimes know which crew has what guys should become a host of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was, what about piece workers or where you have jobs that the crew changes out every day? I wonder, so if, let's say that like in your case, let's say you're the general and you're requiring everybody to be vaccinated. To me, that would be a conversation I'd want to have before all the workers come. Let's leave outside the piece workers. So let's just say I have different crews from that company coming. Then I'd want representation of all those crews before they come on site so that I don't have to, so that you're telling me everyone I'm sending to your site's vaccinated. All 20 of these guys, 2 may be there at a time, these 5 may be there, but I'm letting you know that all 20 that will eventually be on this site at some time are vaccinated, and you do that ahead of time. To me, that would be much easier than trying to have your site guys check everyone. Piece workers is different. I don't know how, with the piece workers, it may be a daily check, and it may be that you as a safety guy, if you're the one on site, that you're the one who gets to check vaccine cards, as opposed to the superintendent. I know. I mean, one more thing, you'd love to be the now you're the vaccine police, right? You were the mask police, and now you're the vaccine police. But yeah, that's the only way I could think, because we still try to keep it limited to a certain group. But technically, if everybody's supposed to be vaccinated coming on site, I'd want to try to do as much ahead of time as I could. But yeah, otherwise you'd have to decide who at the site's going to be that person that's going to check them at the gate. Yeah, that's a hard one though. I mean, we'll see how that kind of develops, I think, with your workers on your site and who's dictating it on that site.
I have a
Let's
question.
talk about additional safety restrictions for unvaccinated workers, and then we'll get into mandates. So those that cannot provide proof of vaccination, you can renew your mask requirement. So that's something that we've seen, masks going back into place. Restrictions on business related travel. So we've seen restrictions that, well, if you're not vaccinated, we're not going to let you travel for business. Because we know that you need to quarantine when you come home, so we're going to lose time on you. Try not to be punitive with it, right? So, because what we're trying to prevent is that unvaccinated workers, or those that don't want to give their status, that they claim retaliation. They claim that these additional protocols were done in a punitive manner or done in a retaliatory manner. We've seen a lot of whistleblower cases through COVID. But OSHA's not really all that excited about whistleblower cases when someone says they made me wear a mask or they made me get a COVID test, at least so far. I never try to predict what the agency does anymore. But at least so far, that really hasn't concerned them all, that because their view was, well, that's within their rights, that if you're unvaccinated, they can require you to wear a mask. And it's consistent with OSHA's guidance. We had a manufacturing client, they had an outbreak probably about a month or so ago. So they reinstituted a mask requirement for all their employees, and they had one employee who quit over it, and sent, pretty nasty emails to them about, this mask requirement, and I said, it's a mask. This isn't even a vaccine mandate, right? So, I mean, you never know quite what's going to trip people out. So just one thing to keep in mind, that you can renew these mask requirements and testing and different things that you can do for your unvaccinated workers. Yeah.
You require the new mask requirement.
Uh-huh. Mm. Right.
But I'm not in HR.
Right.
Is that realistic?
I mean, we hear that concern. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was, that one of the complaints about putting a mask requirement in just for unvaccinated workers is the stigma, and what may come from that. So, the best we've come up with is try to do some of that training for the workforce of, look, you don't know why someone's wearing a mask. They may still be vaccinated and they may live with a grandparent who's ill or has cancer or, something. So they want to wear a mask and they're vaccinated. So, don't presume that they're unvaccinated, and do that training and try to, talk to employees about not talking politics in the workplace, and, trying not to assume why someone's wearing a mask. And yeah, I mean, we've seen discipline, to employees who have shamed others for wearing a mask, right? Because, it's workplace bullying. It could be at some level. That's part of the consent form that we have where we let people take a mask off. So I'm going to disclose my vaccination status to you because I want to take my mask off. And I also agree that if I see somebody with their mask off and I don't think they're vaccinated, that I'm not going to approach that person. I'm just going to go to HR if I'm concerned and let them deal with it. So that's one of the things to train people about. Because we did see whenever the mask policy first came out and people started letting vaccinated remove their mask, it was, within hours of so-and-so removed their mask and I know they're not vaccinated, and we started seeing that. So, that's where that training comes into place and trying to talk to them. Because you're right. It's, there's not a great solution for it. But yeah, just talking to your workers about it really becomes the best we can do.
So question on that one.
Yeah.
What about recognition of natural immunity for those that have had it, that have verified antibody testing?
So, the CDC talks about, in respect to quarantining, that if you've had the vaccine or you've had COVID in the last 3 months and you don't show symptoms after exposure, you don't have to quarantine. But we've heard that a lot of places are not going to accept antibody tests in lieu of a vaccine. So to me, if someone, has a high antibody count, so, they may be being advised not to get vaccinated yet because their antibodies are so high, they could get a doctor's note and try to talk to their employer that way and see if they would accept that. Because I've got a friend of mine in West Virginia who had COVID. Everyone in his family he had a severe case, and he's actually part of a university study where he gives blood every week because almost a year later his antibodies are still off the chart. So I think he's probably an exception, which is why he's in this study and he gives blood every week. But there are people like that, who their antibodies are real high. So yeah, I think you just have to deal with it on a doctor basis and see, because you're right, there is, the CDC does talk about exposure and quarantining with it. But I know a lot of the vaccine mandates we've seen are not wanting to accept antibody tests in lieu of vaccines. So yeah, I think it'd have to be one of those on an individualized one-on-one basis to deal with. Because like my friend Jason was telling me, I shouldn't have said his name. Like he was telling me he goes on sites and they want to be vaccinated, and he's got this whole note from this study about it because he can't, and he's like special child with it. So I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully something comes from these studies. Okay, we're gonna talk about this. Okay, vaccine mandates. So we've kind of talked about everything else, right? So we were trying to incentivize. Now we decided we're just going to mandate. I want to talk about what the EEOC says about it. Reasonable accommodations, which is similar to incentive accommodations. It's going to be a similar discussion you're going to have with your employees. So the EEOC guidance first came out in December, and they updated it in May, so not too long ago. EEOC is always supported that you can require workers to get the vaccine. And even when we were under temporary status, which we're not now under Pfizer, that did not change it from the EEOC's perspective. So, but I know that many times was a complaint we heard from employees, but now we at least have one that has been fully accepted. So, when you're requiring it, you want to consider the employee's duties and work settings. Because one of the things, that's part of this analysis is, when can you exclude an employee for not being vaccinated? And this, from a legal perspective, they've got to be a direct threat. And so that's where you're deciding that this unvaccinated worker poses a significant risk of harm, which cannot be eliminated by an accommodation, right? So that's a pretty high bar that you cannot accommodate. It could be met. Probably in certain healthcare settings, potentially in nursing home settings, right? We may be able to meet that standard. But the idea is there a accommodation that lets that person stay in the workplace?
So you're talking about a direct threat to themselves or others?
Both. So I can decide as an employer that you are a direct threat to yourself or to others. So for example, put it in easy terms for us as, construction industry safety professionals. You've got a guy on your work site who refuses to wear fall protection, right? You train him. Every time you walk by, he takes it off. You may end up firing him because he's a direct threat to himself, right? Because he just will not comply. And that someday he's going to hurt himself. Right? So that's the same idea that is this a threat to them? That's probably harder with COVID threat to them, but at least threat to others, especially if they're in a healthcare or nursing home setting. Are they dealing, what's their patient population? Looks different for an office worker, right? And when you're trying to look at that direct threat analysis. But this applies when we're talking, so everyone keep in mind with accommodation. So when we're talking about direct threat, keeping people in the workplace, accommodations, this is for people that have a religious objection or a medical or disability objection. So if someone just doesn't want to get it, right? So I just have a personal objection. Under the legal world, you don't have to accommodate me. You may choose to because you're short on workers, but from a legal perspective, you don't have to accommodate that person. That is the one who may make it go elsewhere. So to keep that in mind when you're thinking about who, when we're talking accommodations, because some employers say, we want to accommodate everybody no matter what their objection is, and that's your choice, but just understand what you legally have to do and what you could choose to do. You can always choose to be, to provide more protections. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. They have legitimate medical or religious reasons, and that requires you to evaluate. You've got to have that individualized interactive discussion with them. And I will tell you, the religious objection is tough, right? I mean, medical, fine. Go get a note from your doctor. Your doctor says you have this condition, you can't get it. That's, we've been doing that through the ADA for years. Religion obviously has been out there a long time. We just haven't had to deal with it really until now, especially in the safety world. So that's a hard one. We just put out on our website an article about dealing with the religious accommodations and some different ways to do it, because you can ask someone, it has to be a sincerely held belief. We've got one employer who they're asking them to get certification from like their clergy or their priest or their faith leader that tells them what tenet of the religion prevents them from getting the vaccine. I mean, that's probably pushing the line, right? As much as we want to push this, the objection, but they're like, we've got to get some verification. Yeah, Jeff.
So is remote work considered a reasonable accommodation?
It can be. So the question was, can remote work be a reasonable accommodation? And it can be. And the reason I say can be is because let's say I'm having a meeting and I only want vaccinated workers to go, but my C-suite is there. And this employee says, well, wait a second. I haven't seen my, VP or SVP in a year. I'm getting no FaceTime with that person. So that's where we have to. So I always say, usually, yes, remote work is going to be a good accommodation. If their job duties permit it. But you want to think about that situation where, are they going to have the same, are we going to have a situation where they don't get the FaceTime with upper management that someone else does? And is there a way to accommodate that for that meeting? Potentially, and maybe not. I mean, there may not be. It may be that, we determine we can't do it, right? We've done as much as we can. We're going to Zoom you in, but that's the best we can do. But you've got to at least have that conversation and consideration. Funny story for you on religious beliefs. So I think the best one I've gotten was the Church of the Dude, the religion of the Big Lebowski. So that one, yeah. So that one we advise the employer they could push back on. But so you'll see some things like that. Like, you see others, that appear to be, pretty legitimate. But then you'll see some like that, you kind of scratch your head about. So, just understand the religious objection kind of runs the gamut when people are making those, especially if what we've seen is kind of one worker. I heard there was a church in Texas that developed to be anti-vaccine on the internet, and you could join and be a member, and kind of one worker finds that, and then now all your workers are members of the same church. So, the religious objection is tough. But the best thing you can do is have that interactive process. We're dealing with a case right now, an employee, they had a vaccine mandate back in January based on the healthcare field. Employee was pregnant. Her doctor wrote a note and said she should not get the vaccine based on different complications in her pregnancy. And they determined that they could not accommodate her because she was in patient-facing role. They laid her off. She brought a lawsuit. And the issue that we're just dealing with is the reasonable accommodations. Could they have moved her to a non-patient facing position? Was she qualified? Was there an open position, right? So it's that same analysis you go through with other ADA disability cases. So just make sure you're doing that here before you would eventually lay someone off, because that is the problem, right? Is like, that's what gets analyzed in lawsuits, is that process before you lay the person off. You may be able to, but you just got to make sure, we've tried other options. We've tried to keep them in the workplace or remote work, right? We've tried not to lay them off essentially. If you mandate it, employees may file suit. Like I said, we're dealing with one right now with the ADA claims. It's still in the EEOC process. We saw challenges based on the EAU status. I think now that Pfizer's, fully approved, I think we'll see less of that. Rights to self-expression or political activity. Political beliefs are not religious beliefs, right? So that's something when you get religious accommodations that we always ask, what is the part of your religion that prevents you from getting this vaccine? Not a political belief. Sometimes people, it becomes their political issue. If you're a unionized workforce, we've seen the mandates likely become part of your bargaining process. So be aware of that, that may become something you're going to negotiate over. So yeah, questions about mandates before we move on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, my question. So what about drawing a line in the sand and saying we're only going to test or mandate vaccines for new employees after X date?
So question was, what about mandating vaccines for only new employees after X date? So the problem I have with that, I guess, is why is the current employee not a risk, but the new employee is, right? To me, we've decided that we've got a mandate for a job-related reason, safety of the workforce. That applies to new or current. So yeah, I would be very nervous with that because I can't make the job-related argument if I'm only doing it for new people. Now you could do it. Yeah, you could do it for positions, right? So I could say, like in this healthcare setting, back in January, it was patient-facing positions had to be vaccinated. If you were back office, you did not. We're seeing most employers that are now thinking about mandating, going away from that. They're kind of taking a view of if we're going to do it, we're all in this together. We're not going to just say, okay, you guys in the field have to do it, but us office workers get our cushy jobs and we get to sit and do remote work and don't need vaccinated, right? I think could be some morale problems when you even divide your workforce by it. But we saw that, months ago, but now we're starting to see more of, the company looks at it as a whole, just from, I think, more morale standpoint, not legal perspectives. Any questions online, Colin? Any questions about vaccines, the mandates?
Let me just check. Some of them were covered already.
Okay.
There's one just specific city of Denver kind of question. I don't know if it's an appropriate time for that, but if you work for the city of Denver, been told to get vaccinated or be fired, less than 5 years away from retirement from the city, and don't want to get the vaccine, healthy athletic person, do they have any options to keep the job without getting vaccinated?
Good question. So city worker, I also had gotten a couple inquiries from some teachers, right? DPS, all teachers have to be vaccinated. Didn't want to get vaccinated. They have a mandate. It's get vaccinated or be fired. What are their options? There's not a lot, to be honest with you. The city and the government have done these vaccine mandates under their, authority right now with the pandemic and their rules that they have for safety. So essentially your challenge, let's say you're a teacher, the school has to mandate because they've been told by the mayor that they must do that. So your challenge from a legal perspective is to the mayor. So you're suing the city, challenging their power to do this. That's an expensive proposition. So we had some clients, so let's go back a year ago. So April, May of 2020, remember when all the businesses were being told to shut down? We had a client that was very unhappy with being told to shut down and where they had to limit their business. So we were preparing a constitutional challenge for federal court. And I'll tell you, just getting the briefing ready on that was very, very expensive. We ended up reaching a resolution that kept them open, kind of had to go the lobbyist route, which frankly, I think was a better option than the legal route and filing in court. Would that have been successful? I don't know. It potentially could have slowed the train, but I don't think it's going to stop the train now at this point. So that's the problem you have. Yeah, if you're a city worker or you're a teacher subject to one of these mandates coming from the city or the state, that's going to be tough. Not that there won't be lawsuits. I wouldn't be surprised if we see one, with these mandates. But like I said, that's an expensive proposition because they're operating under their state and city authority. So. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So could they request remote position? So they could request an accommodation, but legally the employer doesn't have to accommodate unless they have a religious or medical objection. So if the objection is just, I don't want to get it, they don't legally have to accommodate that. Yeah, so that's could be the rub for that person and where they're at. So if you don't mandate, should you still inquire about and track vaccination status to determine whether someone's fully vaccinated? The question is, what do we need that information for? Well, we might need it because we're going to let vaccinated people remove their masks. We might need it because we have certain jobs that require it by GC or owner. But think about, if we're not mandating it, do I need this information? Because you may not need it yet. You may be curious, but think about if you need it or not, if you have a policy. Because it does raise privacy concerns, could raise disability discrimination potentially. I mean, the idea is you only ask someone if they've been vaccinated. So it's different if someone wants an accommodation, then we have a different discussion. But if let's say you have a policy that says vaccinated people can remove their mask. So if you want to remove your mask, come show us proof of vaccine. All you're asking for is, are you vaccinated or are you not, period. If you are not, or you don't want to tell me, I don't ask why. And that's the training for your HR people, is to not ask why someone's not vaccinated. Unless we're dealing with a reasonable, they filled out the form and they're asking for a reasonable accommodation for religious or medical reason. Because then we're getting a different set of laws over here, right? But if we're just in this voluntary disclosure, we're not asking why. Because then you do get into disability concerns. Yeah.
So I work for a contractor where we're pretty much driven by the whims of our clients.
Mm-hmm.
Up to them to decide mandates to say.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, in any sort of position of discrimination per se, if what we have is, I'm not going to use names, but client X requires vaccinations, so because they're a government entity,
Mm-hmm.
so we track those people so we know who we can assign to their site. And then as all this unfolds, 4 of the 5 new projects also have it. So we're telling this group of people, you can have any of these jobs, but you 5 of you have to go home, 5 of you are going to work this job because you're not vaccinated.
Right. So
That's just
yeah.
the condition of the market. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
are we in a position of discriminating because we have that list?
Yeah. So the question is, are we, if I can summarize it short for the video, are we in a position of discriminating if our jobs are that we're getting from the contract requirements say people have to be vaccinated? And so we've got 5 jobs for vaccinated employees, and I've only got, say, 1 job for unvaccinated. So those, 5 employees that are unvaccinated go to the unvaccinated job, and the other 5 don't have work that week. I don't see that you're in actionable discrimination, right? Like, I mean, if someone, obviously someone could try to say it's discrimination, I can't get vaccinated. So you'd have to try to accommodate them. But if we go through that process with someone who can't get vaccinated, we may not be able to accommodate them. So to me, they wouldn't have a claim that ultimately stands up in court, right? I mean, like I said, yeah, as discrimination, because frankly, it's now become a job requirement, so it's one of those that, it becomes like a term of the contract. They're saying they have to be vaccinated. Yeah.
That was my question.
Yeah.
On the client end, but I keep that list because now the next
Yeah.
that says they have to vaccinate already on the list. It's having that list
But-
created discriminatory practice.
No, I don't think just having the list creates a discriminatory practice, because frankly, you have to have the list. I mean, you have to have the list in order to staff your jobs, right? I mean, that's what we were talking about, Dave, with like the list. If you want everybody on the site to be vaccinated, getting that list ahead of time, I just think you have to have it. So yeah. No problem. No, it's tricky. Should you ask for proof? If you're allowed, meaning we have a reason why we need to, like you were saying, for the job, then yes. I don't support just the honor system. Frankly, it just doesn't work. We saw that with masking. So if you've got to have proof, you've got to have documentation, get proof, look at the cards and verify it. I mean, with the state and the city mandates that came out, they require you to verify, and and look at the documentation. You know, OSHA supports that view. So OSHA's view is if you want to remove masks, it's your job as the employer to ensure that you don't have unvaccinated people not wearing a mask. So how do you as the employer ensure that? Well, you have to check for proof of vaccination. So I think it supports it. We talked about state and city, they're requiring it. And the definition of proof could vary. So if you're out like in California, you know, Cal OSHA's had its own rules this whole time, and they have, you know, their own definition of what proof is. So, you know, just look at that, especially if you're dealing with jobs as to what they want you to do. Because we were saying some may want you to upload the card, others may let you verify that. Yeah. Yeah, so the attestation, right, that I sign and verify, I guess it depends on the requirement. It's not as good as verifying. To me, if the job says you need to verify vaccination, then no, I don't think just having an employee sign saying they are is good enough. Simply because you haven't verified, right? You haven't taken that step. But if you're going to have, but you know, what we saw with masking policies is a lot of employers said, we're going to let you remove a mask. We're doing it either, we won't go the honor system. We'll have you sign something that says that you're vaccinated because we don't want to look at cards. That's better than the honor system, right? That's kind of how I've looked at it. I mean, it's better than just the honor system. It's not as good as looking at cards. So it really depends on, but like I said, we had some clients that were just adamant. They don't want to look at cards, you know, and they weren't currently under a mandate that they had to, like from the city and state or a GC or an owner. So then you could make that decision that you're going to accept that. But, you know, just understand the risk you take on because you haven't yet verified it. Yeah.
That was my question.
Yeah.
When you say the honor system isn't good, it's because the risk you're taking on.
The risk that you would have. So if you're masking is the easiest one, right? So if you do the honor system that says, okay, everyone who's vaccinated can remove their mask, kind of like the sign we saw on the door when we came in here today, right? That's the honor system. You're taking the risk as the employer that your unvaccinated people are still wearing a mask and that they haven't taken it off. And you're, you know, hoping that they follow it. I mean, you know, so where's the legal risk? That really falls from, let's say we have an outbreak. We have 3 or 4 people. OSHA comes in, they do an investigation and they find out you have unvaccinated workers without masks on. And they say, well, what'd you do to verify or to ensure they were wearing it, right? And they say, oh, we just had the honor system. They may decide that wasn't enough to ensure the safety of your unvaccinated workers. You know, so it's all that kind of risk, you know, analysis. We have seen a few general duty clause citations now based on COVID. You know, so I don't know that we've seen any in Colorado. Definitely seen them in other states. So that's, you know, that's your ultimate legal risk. Yeah. So you're just a couple more slides here. I was still good on time. Okay. Most jurisdictions you can ask about vaccination status. Montana, you cannot. So it's been the one state that, since they're out here in the West, has been on my radar. You cannot ask about it. So, you know, different rules there. We've heard, you know, Florida, a lot of people think Florida, you cannot ask about vaccination status as to a customer, but you can as to an employee. So if you're operating in other states, just make sure you check those rules because it's different. You know, a lot of places have done, you heard the vaccine passports, that kind of became a buzz term. That was usually for customers, you know, so like in New York right now, to go into restaurants in New York City, you got to show a vaccine. That's a vaccine passport, right? And that's what they've said in Florida you can't do. You can't deny service to a customer because they don't have vaccine. Different employer-employee relationship is different than the customer. So just, you know, if you're operating in other states, just something to check and what that looks like. But the EEOC has come out saying it's not a medical examination, which is why we're all asking about it. So 3 years ago, if you would have just asked me, is asking about vaccination status a medical inquiry? I would have said, yeah, I think so. But that's what they've come out, that it's not a medical exam. To me, that was probably a function of the fact that we're in a pandemic and how else do we verify it? But that's what the rule is we're living with. So as we talked about earlier, when you're asking employees about status, we don't want to know any other information, right? We don't want to know the why. We don't want to know any other information about it. All right, so what if an employee refuses to disclose it? So you can remind them of, you know, what's our legitimate business reason that we're asking? Maybe we have a job. We have to know who's vaccinated, know who we can staff. ensure you've got a process to address reasonable accommodation. So who's going to do that? Who's accepting the forms? Make sure they know how to apply. You can consider whether reprimanding an employee for declining to disclose their status could be viewed as per se mandatory policy. So meaning that if someone refuses to disclose their status, are we going to discipline them? Probably means we have a mandatory policy if we're doing that, right? So if we don't have a mandatory policy and someone doesn't want to disclose status, we just treat them as unvaccinated, right? We're likely not disciplining them because we don't have a mandatory policy. And that's what we recommended is you treat them as unvaccinated. So what's some next steps here? I'll leave you with some kind of final thoughts on kind of where to go next, depending on what you're looking at for your company. So have a procedure for how you're going to collect vaccination status. So who's going to do that? Are we going to look at cards? I mean, I was talking to one employer. They said, well, our guys are out in the field. How do I look at their cards without getting copies? And so we talked about FaceTime, right? Can they show you over FaceTime? That way you can verify cards of guys on site. So that may be a thought too, right? With these workers that come on for one day, you don't want your project superintendent verifying. Maybe we have someone who they're FaceTiming with in HR. We can get creative with technology, right? Of how we do this, but just thinking that through ahead of time of what is going to be our process. Once it's collected, figure out your percentage of how many employees are vaccinated. Evaluate the approach or the combined approach that's most successful among your employee population. So are we going to mandate? How's that going to go over with our employees? Are we going to be forced to mandate based on all of our customer contracts? I think we're seeing a lot of that. Are we just going to incentivize, and how do we want to do that? And then, putting your written policy together that gives your employees all this information, right? Here's how we're going to collect it. And here's what this looks like. Here's the accommodation forms. Here's who to take the forms to, and knowing who's going to handle that. Just thinking of all this ahead of time is going to save you a lot of headaches once you go to implement it. Depending, whichever policy you choose, whether it's even just an informational, even if you're just putting out information of who's putting that information out, how often we're going to do it, right? So just thinking through ahead of time saves you a lot of headache later. So let me see here. Oh yeah. So I've mentioned our website a couple of times. We have like a vaccine resource center. So if you go on our main page, fisherphillips.com, there's a button to click on for Vaccine Resource Center. Like I said, a lot of like 50 state issues. There's some sample policies. There's the accommodation forms. It's free. So we've tried to do this, since I think March of 2020, putting information out there because this was new to everybody, right? And we're all trying to learn and deal with this as we go. Like we said, the Denver mandate, I was confused about even over the weekend with some new orders. So, I mean, this, when people call me, it's like, well, let me check things because it changes so fast now. And I think that's what's hard, especially for all of you who are trying to run and do a, full-time job. And then those of us in the legal world that are still living with this, it's still changing so fast for us. And this is our day job. So it's tough to keep up with it. So, yeah, happy. Did you have another question?
It was a liability question. What liability does the employer have for any immediate adverse reactions to the vaccine or side effects that show up later down the road?
So question about vaccine side effects. So if you mandate the vaccine, then if you're, let's back up one. If you're in Colorado, all employees have access to public health emergency leave. If they haven't used all their time yet, they get to use that for vaccine side effects. So that would cover it. But if you mandate it, it likely could be a workers' comp issue. I think I've only heard of one time where it's actually been kicked up to the workers' comp level from vaccine. Most of the time, it's that couple days, you're down sick, you don't feel well, they take their public health emergency leave and they're back to work. But if it's mandated legally, I think you'd have an argument it could fall under workers' comp if we got to a serious issue. But like I said, we haven't seen many of those. Yeah.
Let's be expanded into non-COVID. Say you're required to get a flu shot. Who's even going to get?
Yeah.
A lot of people get sick and die from the flu.
I mean, it'll be interesting. I mean, I know some of my healthcare clients, they've had that mandate for a long time for their employees, right? That they have to get the flu shot. Because something we were talking about is they had a lot of employees who have always gotten the flu shot. Now they don't want to get the COVID shot. So we're saying, okay, but you didn't have an objection to the flu shot. We've had that mandate for a long time. So potentially, yes. I don't know if it would extend outside healthcare though. I think there might be too much public pushback, but we'll see. Say again. On record keeping. Well, and OSHA's come out and actually said that if that an employer, I think they put a deadline on it, at least for right now, you do not have to record employee reactions to the vaccine if you've mandated it. Because before, if you mandated it, an employee went down for a couple days sick with a vaccine, that's arguably a recordable injury, right? Days away from work. So they put out a special, basically carve out and said, right now, because we want to encourage the vaccine, you don't have to record it. So we're still in that right now. But yeah, well, I mean, you would, but I think they're just saying they want people to encourage it. And so people were worried about, well, if we encourage it, they go down for a couple of days. Now I'm having to record it and it's making all my numbers go up. And so they said, okay, we're going to do a carve out. If you mandate the COVID vaccine, someone goes down for a couple of days, you don't have to put that on your OSHA log. Yeah, I mean, you probably would still have your reportability issues, but I think but just look on their website. They've got like a whole FAQ. OSHA has a whole FAQ, and that was one of the questions. And they had kind of made that special question that, and I want to say they put a time limit on it. But I don't remember what the end date was, but I know we're still in that time period, at least, that you're not recording for vaccine downtime. Yeah.
You know, are a lot of places still doing the health assessment before people come up in the building or not?
Yeah, question was, are a lot of people doing the health assessment? No, we're not seeing a lot of health assessments being done. You know, that was more of like a state requirement, right? That was in Governor Polis's orders that we had to be doing those every morning. So when that went away in the public health order, most employers, it went away. Although I will say, I heard last week, and I can't remember if this company was in Colorado or not, but they just started having a few outbreaks again. And so they are reinstituting health screens because they're starting to see more COVID cases in the workplace again. So I haven't seen a lot yet, you know, but it'll be interesting if, you know, where Delta goes and where our numbers go, if that would come back. But right now it's at least not mandated by the public health order. Yeah, Lori. Okay.
Thinking down the line, different variants, whatever, if the vaccine just becomes totally not good on efficacy or something like that, does this just explode everything?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I had the answer to that question. Oh yeah. So the question was, you know, let's say we have more variants, the vaccine becomes not effective. Yeah. What does this look like? I don't know. Are we back to where we were in May of 2020 and we're looking at lockdowns and health screens? I know. I hope not. Right. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. If I had my crystal ball, you know, I would have never predicted when we were talking about COVID last summer, it was like, okay, a few more months, you know, we're all going to be back. I mean, so I would never have thought a year ago that we were still talking about it today. So yeah, if anyone wants to weigh in on that question, but I'm not going to try to predict where we're going anymore. Yeah. Good question. So how do boosters play in? So I think it may end up affecting that fully vaccinated definition. So we've started putting on our forms so we don't have to redo them. You know, fully vaccinated means within 2 weeks, you know, post Pfizer, Moderna, 1 J&J, or as presently defined by the CDC. Because yeah, we've wondered that as well, is that, you know, in 3 to 4 months, will fully vaccinated mean that you have to have a booster? Potentially, right? I don't know. I'm not a scientist on that, but it makes me think, but I think that's a good thing to be thinking about, that fully vaccinated definition may change. And then, you know, the issue is going to be, from a fully vaccinated standpoint, you've got all these people on jobs. How long do they have to get the booster? Yeah, I know. I mean, I have a friend who's an ER doc and he already had his booster like 2 weeks ago. So it's, you know, it's rolling out in the healthcare field. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
last one. If unvaccinated workers would be required to be masked, is the employer required to provide the mask?
So if unvaccinated workers have to, question, if unvaccinated workers have to wear a mask, should the employer provide the mask? Yes, because you're requiring it. So a year ago, or was it a year ago? 6 months? We're taking the position you didn't have to provide masks. I guess that would have been a year ago. But now that we've drawn these distinctions, especially with vaccinated, unvaccinated, I look at it as it's now become a requirement of the workplace and you should provide it. And I want to say OSHA may have some guides. I know OSHA definitely has said you must provide it in California. And I was trying to think if OSHA's got similar guidance now. They may. But I think it's a safer bet to provide it now that you're requiring it. Although most employees now have their own and bring their own. So it may just be if someone would ask. I mean, I think if you're going to, if you're going to, I would definitely make the offer that you can provide it.
I'm gonna steal that mic from you.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, right, to everybody. Let's give Kristen a big hand. Thank you for doing that. We appreciate you for speaking and coming in. Gift card coming.
No worries.
Anyway, thank you all for showing up. I really appreciate you coming here and making this hybrid opportunity. Thank you for everybody online and your questions. We're going to hopefully post the recording as permitted. So keep your eye out on emails and things like that on posting the recording. But I say thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. Let me close this up.